Well, hello once again, my friends, my fellow ship lovers, and my fellow lovers of everything interesting. I'd like to welcome you back to another video. Today's video is going to be on a ship, a very beautiful ship in fact. However, it may not be the type of ship that you're used to seeing on my channel. Having been born and raised in New England, I'm close to Boston, as well as New York. The North Atlantic has been my home area all my life. I've been a lover of ships since I was old enough to understand how they worked. I've always loved sailing vessels as well as ocean liners. It'd be one of my childhood heroes that would introduce me to the Britannic. Jacques Cousteau would discover the Britannic and introduce me to Titanic's younger sister. I immediately fell in love with the Olympic class from the White Star Line. From there I learned about the RMS Titanic as well as the RMS and HMT Olympic. I remember the news broadcast that announced that Dr. Robert Ballard, another childhood hero of mine, found one of the boilers of the RMS Titanic. To this day, the RMS Titanic is my all-time most beloved ship. But that's for another video. The only reason I bring this up is that I recently discovered another type of vessel. You may know or notice I did a video on a lot of model kits that I had won, a vintage lot, and the reason I had wanted it was because of the presentation set for the SS United States. Well, one of those model kits was a riverboat that was named the Robert E. Lee. The riverboats. This vessel type appears to be clumsy and disproportionate, but graceful at the same time. I'm referring to the paddle wheel steamboats. When I think of the ocean liners, sailing vessels, or even battleships, I think of how they're built to glide through or cut through the water. However, I'm discovering that riverboats are built to actually glide on top of the water. They have a much shorter draft than the ships of the North Atlantic have. This type of vessel is built to navigate on the Mississippi River. They must be much more mindful of the bottom and the damage it can cause, rather than the deep-sea vessels are. The development and history of these ships are fascinating. I hope you enjoy the video and enjoy watching as much as I enjoyed researching them, as well as today's topic, the Robert E. Lee. The Robert E. Lee was a river steam paddle boat with her wheels on her sides. Each wheel would be 38 feet in diameter and 17 feet wide. She was owned by Captain John W. Cannon, and she was built specifically for travel along the Mississippi River. Built by DeWitt Hill in Albany, Indiana, the Robert E. Lee was launched in 1866. Her price tag would exceed $200,000, which was a very steep price tag for the time period. She would be built for speed, cargo transport, as well as passenger accommodation. In her decade-long service time, she would participate in a historic race that would cement her legacy in the history books in 1870. But more of that in a moment. The Robert E. Lee would be 285.5 feet long. Her beam would be 46 feet with a depth of hold at 9 feet. The ship would have a top speed of 15 miles per hour, or just over 13 knots. She would weigh 1,467 tons. The ship would have the biggest, most advanced engines of her time. She would be propelled by twin high-pressure steam engines, with cylinder bores of 40 inches with a stroke of 10 feet. Those would be fueled by 8 Stuckey and Company boilers. These would produce up to 120 pounds of steam pressure. Her wrought iron shafts would be 23 feet each, weighing well over 18,000 pounds. And each of her cranks were also wrought iron and weighed 6,000 pounds. These were the largest of her day. The Robert E. Lee also was equipped with 3 pumping fire engines and hoses in case of fire. She would be capable of transporting up to 5,741 bales of cotton. which was the most prized commodity of the time period. The ship was built with 61 staterooms in the main cabin. This was carpeted with lush A.T. Stewart custom carpeting from New York. There was an additional 24 more rooms in the Texas for additional passengers, and the Texas would be 140 feet long with 24 passenger rooms. She also had a nursery as well as accommodations for servants as well as crew quarters. Her main cabin dining room could seat up to 240 guests, with 20 extension tables that could seat up to 12 guests each. Storage included 2 baggage rooms that could store luggage for all the passengers on board. The Robert E. Lee was a showpiece of the time period, boasting the most lavish and technically advanced machinery the Mississippi River had seen up to that point. But as with all leaders, despite the field of expertise, there is heavy competition. The Robert E. Lees would come in the form of the Natchez. The Natchez was also a modern sidewheel steamboat. Now, when it comes to being the fastest vessel on the Mississippi, that was to be a huge accomplishment. If you're familiar with ocean liners crossing the North Atlantic, the fastest record for crossing each way is rewarded with the coveted blue ribbon. This is a ribbon the vessel sails proudly. The SS United States currently still holds the blue ribbon for crossing the North Atlantic in just over 4 days. Just for comparison, it took the Mayflower nearly 4 months to cross. However, when it comes to riverboats and steamboats, there is still a proud display to show that accomplishment. However, instead of a blue ribbon, it is displayed in the form of golden antlers. These pair of antlers are proudly displayed over the wheelhouse for all to see and admire. The Natchez, not to be confused with the modern-day Natchez, formerly the Clairton, would challenge the Robert E. Lee to a race to settle once and for all who was the fastest ship on the Mississippi. The Natchez would be captained by Thomas P. Leathers. At the time, the Natchez was the holder of the golden antlers as the fastest boat on the river. Supposedly, Captain Leathers and Captain Cannon of the Robert E. Lee had a fight while in a bar. The result of the ill will shared by both captains would lead to a race for the winner-take-all bragging rights of being the fastest ship on the Mississippi. The race would start at the port of New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River Delta and end in St. Louis. The first riverboat to arrive would win the race and secure the golden antlers to display over the pilot house. At approximately 5 p.m. on June 30th of 1870, the race between the Robert E. Lee and the Natchez would start in New Orleans. Riverboats were lined up, as well as spectators along the riverbanks, to witness the unofficial race between the boats. Many bets would be taken as well on who the victor would be. This event would become the most famous steamboat race of all time. In a record time, 3 days, 18 hours, and 14 minutes, the Robert E. Lee would pull into St. Louis, winning the race. Her time has never been broken, even to this day. Captain Leathers had to relinquish the golden antlers to Captain Cannon after the race. The bets would include millions of dollars that were made worldwide. Sadly, the Robert E. Lee would catch fire in 1882. Too costly to repair, she would be dismantled, and many of her parts would be used to make an updated version of her namesake. The new Robert E. Lee would be a rear paddle steamboat and not quite live up to her previous namesake. Captain John Cannon would also have his name live on, as a side wheel steamboat in his honor would be named, and it would be built in 1898.